right, we have quite a diverse, varied audience today. Thank you for coming. In case you haven't met me, I am Rafi Hayward. I'm one of the assistant directors of the Global Systems Institute, which is an interdisciplinary research network across the university. And we're always really excited to form ties and catalyze ties in the community and make connections between researchers and lots of people and activists included. And we have a really strong activist community in Exeter and with us today. So I'm really excited about that. So today we are welcoming Dr. Rupert Read, who is a very prominent figure, especially in XR, Extinction Rebellion. He was one of the spokespeople for Extinction Rebellion in the early years, in the sort of 2018, 2019, pre-pandemic, when things were really kicking off. And he was one of the few people who were in the room with the then Secretary of State, Michael Gove, to have that conversation that led to the government declaring a state of climate emergency in 2019. And also, Rupert is very active talking about climate change and dealing with the media, and did have clashes, refused to engage on platforms, including the BBC back in 2018, 2019. Maybe you remember that they were media, when they had a debate about climate change, they always wanted to have environmentalists pitted against climate deniers. And Rupert refused to do that. And eventually the BBC said, okay, actually, we shouldn't be doing this. So, but that wasn't that long ago. That was only like 5 years ago, which just scares me. Anyway, so Rupert was an academic, is a philosopher, and a couple of years ago, he decided to quit his job, to quit academia, to focus full-time on activism. He's the co-founder, co-director of the Climate Majority Project, which he's going to be telling us about today. And also, Rupert has written a number of books, some of which are here, and he's going to be telling us about Transformative Adaptation, which is his newest book, and which you can buy, I'm told, for a tenner?
Yes, they're all 10 quid.
10 quid, and get it signed, so it's really a deal. And also, you can sign up to a variety of mailing lists today. So we've got, Climate Majority Project, Rupert Read's monthly newsletter, and the occasional course-related emails. So this is going to be going around. Feel free to put your
Don't forget the GSI
address. And yes, of course, if you're not on the GSI mailing list, then this is your chance. And I'm going to circulate a link online as well if you're online. And the reason you want to sign up for the GSI mailing list is because we have a lot of regular events that are, some of them are more specialist than others, but most of them we want to be accessible to all and to transcend any single discipline and to talk about the big picture issues. And in particular, we're running assemblies, community assemblies. I'm sure Rupert's going to talk about those. So yeah, sign up for the GSI mailing list as well. And if you're on the mailing list, then you will be informed about, you can also grab a leaflet in a couple of weeks' time on the 14th of May, Wednesday afternoon. We're going to do a follow-up to today's session for us to basically put into practice what Rupert is going to be talking about today, transformative adaptation, see how we can make it work in Exeter, in our community, in the university, wherever you want to make it work. And Lewis and I are going to be co-facilitating that. So please put that in your calendars. All right, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rupert Read.
Are you going to send those flyers around for the thing, or you could do that at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine, good, because I think that's really exciting and I want to support what you're doing there. It's a great way of following up today. So look, folks, there's a very short version of this talk, and it kind of goes like this. So we're in serious trouble. How much trouble are we in? Well, I'm going to apologize for using a highly technical description at this point of the trouble that we're in. We're in fucking terrible trouble. Most of you probably know that. You may not have a full understanding of it. One way which I think is quite helpful and vivid, if you are possibly in that category, is the following. So about 20 years ago, the Earth's energy imbalance, this is slightly technical, but I'll explain it. The Earth's energy imbalance was 3 Hiroshimas per second. That's a lot of heat. What that means is that the Earth was keeping within its atmosphere as a result of the greenhouse effect approximately the equivalent of the heat released by 3 Hiroshima bombs every second, day in, day out, etc., etc. 3 Hiroshima bombs, I mean, that's quite a lot of heat, right? So it's well-known fact that briefly, when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, the temperature was hotter than the surface of the sun, right? So that's a lot of heat. So that's what it was at about 20 years ago. So what's it at now? Well, it varies. It goes up and down a bit. Right now, it's at about 11. So on that measure, the climate crisis has got about 4 times worse over the last 20 years. People say, oh, the trouble with the climate crisis is that it's too slow. It's too slow for human psychology. That's kind of true. There's something in that. Like, it's not as fast as COVID was, for example, or nothing like it. But something getting almost 4 times worse in just one generation, that's pretty bad if it was already not good, right? From 3 Hiroshimas per second to 11 Hiroshimas per second. We're in really, really serious trouble. Here's another way of putting it. So we're in this terrible trouble, right? And at the very same time that we're in this terrible trouble, that this trouble has got a lot worse in the last couple of years. The Earth's temperature's been leaping up in the last couple of years. The Earth's energy imbalance has been getting a lot worse in the last couple of years. At that very same moment, politics is tending to pull back from any kind of serious climate action. The most striking example of this, there are many, but the most striking example of this, of course, is what's happening in the United States right now, which is really terrifying and atrocious in terms of Trump and the Republicans deliberately defunding and attacking and pulling out of and reversing climate and environmental action on a large scale. So you've got this horrendous irony. The situation seems to be spiraling out of control, and at the very same time, those who should be in a position to do something about it, some of the most powerful, are moving in the opposite direction. And in that gap, as it gets wider and wider, that's an indication of this technical phrase I used a moment ago, fucking terrible trouble that we're in. So the short version of the talk goes basically like this. When you're in that kind of terrible trouble, it's just not good enough anymore to say, oh, well, we have to decarbonize and let's double down and we can achieve Paris and stay below 1.5 degrees of average global overheat. So that's all just nonsense, right? Fundamentally, climate policy and climate activism and climate politics has mainly failed, right? We can now kind of say that in a way that we couldn't say it 5 years ago, or even really in any kind of definitive way 2 years ago. We're in a situation of much more categorical failure now than we were even just a few years ago. We have to rethink, and part of that rethink has to involve taking seriously the need to cope with this fucking terrible trouble, right? So it's not enough anymore to say, oh, well, we can still prevent crisis and disaster, or let's mitigate, or let's decarbonize. No, we have to build resilience, which means we have to adapt. We have to try to cope with the situation. But we have to do that in a way which actually rises to the full gravity of the challenge of that situation. So here's one way in which it would be totally inadequate to talk about adaptation. And this is sometimes called shallow adaptation or reactive adaptation. Somebody who says, well, look, okay, yeah, so things are getting really fucking terrible, and we're having to cope with these worsening impacts. So we need to do things which are designed to just respond directly to those impacts where those impacts arise. So classic example would be floodwaters are getting higher, so we need to build higher hard flood defenses, right? That is self-evidently an inadequate response to this fucking terrible trouble, right? Because If that's all that you do, then you are just, over time, fragilizing yourselves further, right? You build higher flood defenses, well, sooner or later, those are going to be breached in turn. And then you've potentially got an even worse disaster than you had before, right? Rather than just everyone kind of having their basements flooded or whatever, you've suddenly got this wave of water that sweeps through the town and overwhelms everything. If all you try to do is to react defensively and to adapt reactively, right, that's where you're going to end up, getting swept away. So we have to have a form of adaptation which is not like that. You have to have a form of adaptation which is, in the phrase you'll see on this fine book in front of you, transformative. And yeah, that's basically the short version of the talk. We need transformative adaptation. We need transformative adaptation because we've got to actually start to rise to the challenge of this fucking terrible trouble. We've got to do things which go beyond just creating, for example, higher hard flood defenses. We've got to change the way that we live in various not insignificant ways. So in relation to flooding, for instance, you've got to start to think about, okay, well, why are the floodwaters coming so high? And that's partly because of higher rainfall and so on and so forth, but it's also because of bad upland water management and because of the way that we've eliminated lots of the biodiversity and natural bends, etc., in rivers, and because we have too many hard surfaces in our towns and cities. When you start to think that way, then you're starting to think in the vein of transformative adaptation, or what in the Climate Majority Project these days, excuse me, we also call strategic adaptation. It's basically the same thing. I mean, there are differences. I could explain if anyone's interested. But the main reason why we are using this term strategic adaptation sometimes now is we think that it might go down better in places like universities and with governments and so forth. People who like to think that they can think strategically, and it is what we need to do. We need to think transformatively. We need to think strategically about how we adapt to the fucking terrible trouble. And the starting point of that is to start to think, okay, let's move beyond the immediately reactive to a mode of adaptation that could actually work over time, that will transform in response to the threat as that threat morphs and grows, which it's going to do for a long time to come. So that's basically the short version of the talk. But I'm not going to stop there and take your questions just yet, because I've got one or two slightly more interesting things to say to you. The case I've just made is a simple and definitive case for why we need transformative and strategic adaptation. But the case can, I think, be deepened and enriched and made more compelling and made more exciting in ways that I'm about to adumbrate for you. So to start off that adumbration, I'm going to do something which I think it's important to do when one has a talk based on a book, which is I'm going to give you a tiny reading from the book, so you can get a little bit of flavor of the prose and what we're actually trying to do in this work. So I'm going to read to you some excerpts from the preface to the book, which I wrote. The preface is called From Disgrace to Grace, and it goes like this. The struggle to define adaptation, and I've just started to outline that struggle for you by making this distinction between reactive adaptation and transformative adaptation. The struggle to define adaptation will be nothing less than the defining struggle of the next decade or more. This book represents our endeavor, the endeavor of those collected together in this book. It's an edited book, thus far in that struggle. The mystery is not why this is needed, nor why we are here. The mystery is why there's not been far more attention, including of the kind we are offering, to adaptation already. The mystery is why there's been such resistance to adaptation and narratives, given that unlike what is called in the lingo mitigation of the climate crisis, i.e. direct efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, etc., adaptation offers immediate localized co-benefits. And this is close to the heart of what I want to elaborate for a little bit longer in this talk in a few minutes' time. This important point of distinction between adaptation and mitigation. The core of the answer that our book offers to this mystery of why adaptation hasn't been more prominent so far, given that it offers these immediate localized co-benefits, is that when we realize that we need to talk about adaptation, then we can no longer pretend that everything is going to be fine. Continuing that pretense has up to this point been something that most environmentalists have typically done, just as much as most politicians, not to mention climate deniers, have done. The obverse, the corollary of the point I've just made, is hugely exciting and points to a potential significance of this book far beyond its slim pages. Adaptation of the right kind wakes people up like nothing else. It is a slow, endless mind bomb. When people hear talk of 2050 or 2100 in relation to talk of reducing emissions, too often their eyes glaze over. But when people see their neighbors or compatriots, or indeed the authorities, engaging in practical forms of adaptation, they get it. Human-triggered climate decline is real. It's coming. It's here. These people, us, people, are actually doing something about it. We're seeking to adapt. The failure, by and large, to get at all serious yet about the right kind of adaptation, that's the defining adaptation point, a failure that this book aims to overcome, is above all a failure of mitigation, of imagination. Above all, a failure of imagination. Mitigation, plus limited, merely defensive, shallow, reactive adaptation, is easier for our system to contemplate. Because if you don't get serious about adaptation, you don't have to imagine real change in the world. At least not within the kind of time horizons within which our society largely operates. And you don't have to imagine change that actually affects the nature of your life, that transforms anything. You can imagine, you can pretend that we can simply change what powers our energy system and enjoy a serene transition. If this was ever possible, it certainly isn't now. As 2022's IPCC reports and 2023's insane off-the-charts weather and temperature readings, which are still going on now, have made starkly clear. Transformative adaptation, can thus feel threatening to some. It will certainly shake things up. And trad demands attention to the priorities of those on the climate front lines, those whose lives have already been drastically shaken, especially in the global south, where more trad has thus far happened than in the global north, because the crisis is felt much more directly and frequently there. Adaptation has to date been the poor relation, partly because the global north has been more willing to fund mitigation than adaptation in the global south. This solves the final element in the mystery that I outlined above, why to date mitigational action and talk has flourished far more than adaptational. It is precisely because the benefits of mitigation in the global south for the global north are more than those of adaptation in the global south. Right? If somebody else reduces their carbon emissions, you benefit. Whereas if somebody else adapts to the effects of climate change and they're far away, you don't benefit. You see? The localized nature of the effects of adaptation means it's great for the people where you are, but kind of irrelevant in terms of what people do far away from you. Likewise, for dissolving the mystery of why the poor in the global north have been bombarded with information about mitigation, but not about adaptation, because the rich care little about how the poor will adapt. You understand? It's something crazy about the way we've been saying to people, well, look, the really important thing is you reduce your carbon footprint, when the people who are being asked to reduce their carbon footprint have, in many cases, very low carbon footprints. The way that climate is or should be relevant to, well, most people, and certainly most poor people, most working class people, etc., is by way of adaptation primarily, not by way of mitigation primarily. So we've made an enormous kind of strategic mistake there. Why have you made that mistake? Well, possibly because rich people will benefit from poor people mitigating, but they won't benefit directly from them adapting. What a disgrace. That disgrace is part of what we aim to, well, mitigate and start to overcome in these slender pages. So, by grace and graft, may we together find a way through what is upon us as wisely as we can. May we grace the future with more sense than humanity has yet managed to adapt to. That's my little reading from the preface to the book. And what I'm going to do in the remainder of my time here before we switch to the Q&A is go in a little more to those key points that were present in that preface, starting with the point around the collective action problem, so-called, the collective action tragedy of dangerous climate change. So this is a way of understanding, there are many ways of understanding why we're in the fucking terrible trouble that we're in, but the one I want to pull out for you is the one that was mentioned there, that the nature of the challenge of mitigation or decarbonization is extremely ill-attuned to human systems and human psychology. It's a problem, it's far more than a problem, that is so wicked, as the phrase sometimes goes, that it is, in that sense, quite unsurprising that we have failed to grapple with it and that it is taking us into some truly terrible places. The simple way to explain this, you all have some familiarity with this point, but I'm going to labor it for a moment because I think that sometimes we forget it, and it is absolutely critical. Anybody is, in theory, incentivized to reduce their own, and as I was mentioning, other people's carbon emissions. But the actual effect you can have by reducing your own carbon emissions, even if you're incredibly rich and carbon profligate, is only a minuscule percentage of the total. The impact is basically negligible, right? This is one way of understanding how Trump et al. Are able to get away with what they're doing when they say, oh, let's just forget about taking action on climate. Anyone is incentivized to free ride on anyone and everyone else in relation to the benefits of decarbonization, yeah? The incentive of a selfish agent is perhaps to encourage others to decarbonize, but not to do it at all themselves. And that is kind of writ large in the way that people on the hard right in politics, so in the States, Trump, in this country, Badenoch and Farage are now saying, pronunciation is quite important here. It's Farage, not Farage. Don't make him sound like some kind of glamorous kind of foreign movie star or something. Badenoch and Farage are basically saying, look, let's just be selfish. You know, the rest of the world can decarbonize and we'll benefit from that. They can do that if they want to, but we can't be bothered. We're just going to kind of milk everything we can from the existing system and push economic growth as fast as we can and make ourselves rich. And that's kind of the sort of flip side of the significance of the way that they say, well, look, we're only a very small part of the global economy, so it doesn't really matter that much what we do, right? As long as you focus on the climate crisis straight down the lens of decarbonization and mitigation, you're going to lose. And that's what's been happening. But there is an alternative. And you guessed it, the alternative is to start from impacts. The alternative is to start from taking the adaptation imperative seriously and to point out to people, yeah, you know, okay, I'm afraid it is true. The direct benefit that you will get from decarbonizing is ridiculously slight. But there is something else that you can do that will actually start to benefit you directly. And that's to adapt. That's to build your resilience. So the proposal that we make in the Climate Majority Project now is to begin with impacts, is to begin by saying to people, look, what we need to do is respond together to the terrible trouble that we're in a way which makes ourselves safer against that terrible trouble. But look, it wouldn't make much sense to do that in a way that is actually self-undermining, i.e. in a way which is incredibly high carbon, right? If one aspect of transformative and strategic adaptation ought to be that we do that adaptation in a way which is itself low carbon, in a way which, that's the ultimate in kind of being genuinely strategic, right? Being genuinely transformative. So there's a kind of synergy there, but you start with the impacts and start with getting people to figure out how to make themselves safe together, because there's a strict limit on what you can do by yourself against those impacts. And you take it from there. And this functions as a lived wake-up call, right? In the way I described in that little reading I did from the preface. When people see other people, or for that matter themselves, adapting, they'll be like, I guess it actually is here. It actually is real, isn't it? It's not some kind of distant thing. All the disadvantages of mitigation and decarbonization are countered by adaptation, right? It's not something that is distant in time. It's not something that is abstract. It's not something where you can't get any direct benefit for yourselves by acting on it. Yeah. So in this way, adaptation of the right kind, right? Remember, if we just do reactive adaptation, we just try to save the existing system within, as it were, higher flood defenses, then that's going to be worse than if we hadn't done anything at all. Systemic, transformative, holistic, strategic adaptation does not have the disadvantages of starting with decarbonization. It takes you into the territory. It's a way of making the climate crisis vivid and psychologically real to you and everybody else. It's a way that builds in the advantages, and we shouldn't be ashamed or afraid to do this, of collective, rational self-interest. It's a way that acts within time horizons that human beings can easily imagine and foresee. And when you start going down that route, then you also start to figure out, there are limits to this, right? If we don't actually ultimately start taking decarbonization seriously, then all this adaptation is eventually going to get swept away, right? And this is the point at which I want to end and hand over to yourselves. What's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 15 years? Conventional climate policy and climate politics, ordinary efforts for mitigation and decarbonization are going to continue to fail. People are going to start to get interested in adaptation because there is no alternative, as I described at the start. They're going to mostly initially go for forms of adaptation that are quite reactive and shallow. They're going to think things like, well, yeah, let's just kind of raise the walls in front of our houses. They're going to seek to fund that kind of work and take resources from elsewhere, including from foreign aid, including from decarbonization, in order to fund that. They are going to start to realize that doesn't work, that it's fragile. And the sooner they start to realize, the better. They're going to start to get interested in transformative and strategic forms of adaptation. And the sooner they do that, the better. And we can hasten that process. Yeah. And here's the tricky bit, but it could happen. As a result of all of this and of realizing the limits of any purely adaptation strategy, eventually they may start to think, yeah, you know what? The really strategic way, the really transformative way of changing our systems and making ourselves safer against what is coming is to decarbonize as well. So that is the possible way in which the future might not be truly fucking terrible. If we can do what it says on the cover of the book, get people to realize that another world is still just possible, that the sooner we take a path which is centered upon strategic and transformative adaptation, the sooner we get people into a position where they might just be able to come together and think, all right, yeah, how do we actually start to respond to this terrible trouble that we've now finally realized and really taken in to ourselves is as bad as the scientists were saying to us. That is the best hope I see for us being able to avert an uncontrolled civilizational collapse. It'll probably fail. The trouble is so terrible, we're so deep into it, and I've only, of course, spoken about one aspect of it. But I think it is our best shot. It is the best chance we have of realizing another world without some kind of untold horror of civilizational collapse events. So to finish, my final remarks may sound paradoxical, but I think they are correct. If you care about decarbonization now, the best thing you can do is get serious about adaptation. If you care about a future in which we're able to flourish and see further emergent futures beyond that, then the best thing to do is to start to work with others on getting focused right here and now on what we can do to defend ourselves against what is here and what is coming. Yeah. The way to make the climate crisis concrete for people is to begin with impacts and take people on a journey through taking that seriously, through being tempted by going down the path of reactive adaptation, to realizing that what we really need is transformative and strategic adaptation, to maybe finally, as a result of that process in which there is going to be a great deal of suffering and a great deal of further decline, to maybe finally in, say, 15 years' time, the kind of timing envisaged, for example, by Stephen Markley in his superb climate fiction, The Deluge, maybe getting to the point of finally being able to take the decarbonisation imperative seriously. People say we haven't got time for that, but if you've got a better strategy than that, I'm all ears. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. Questions in the room? If you have questions online, can you please type them in the chat and I'll get to you. And yeah, Jonathan.
Thank you for your talk. Am I allowed to ask a question about your wider body of work?
Yeah.
So in a lot of your media appearances, you have spent a lot of time criticizing more radical environmental organizations. My question is, why do you use that time, that platform, to criticize other environmental activists rather than, say, fossil fuel companies or the government or the super rich? And do you not think that plays into sort of right-wing media narratives and undermines left-wing unity?
Okay, let me have a go. Obviously, come a little bit a distance from what I was talking about, but fine. I'm happy to take questions on anything. Look, a couple of things. Firstly, when I get asked to comment on something on telly, I can't necessarily just talk about whatever else I want to talk about. I might want to talk about transformative adaptation, but they might not be interested in me talking about that. Obviously, you sometimes try to spin things your way, but there's a limit to that. Secondly, yes, I do sometimes criticize other environmental organizations or movements, approaches, whatever, when I'm on the media or whatever. The reason I do that is because I'm really interested in finding an approach that works and is effective. It's easy to criticize fossil fuel companies. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, it seems to me. What I do not want to do is be complicit in the idea of, well, given that we in the environmental movement or whatever are all in some fundamental sense on the same side, therefore we shouldn't criticize each other at all. I think that's a mistake. It was one of the aspects of the culture of Extinction Rebellion that I didn't really agree with, because the problem is if you can't criticize each other at all, then you can't learn. There's no feedback mechanism. It seems to me it's crucial to learn from mistakes. So, for example, I publicly criticized the Canning Town tube action in October 2019. Not just criticized it, I sought to apologize for it, because I thought that it was really important that people understood that the vast majority of people in Extinction Rebellion, let alone the wider public, did not agree with that action and thought it was counterproductive. And I wanted to make sure that that understanding was registered. So the fundamental answer to your question is I am interested in finding an approach which is actually effective. In the cause of that, sometimes, as well as doing what I've done here, which is laying out a sort of positive strategy, if you will, I think it's necessary to delineate reasons for thinking that some other strategic choices are ineffective. I think it's interesting that Just Stop Oil are hanging up their high-vis as of this coming weekend. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian about the decisions that Just Stop Oil have come to make on that front. The author of the article said that he found spontaneously that quite a lot of people in XR and JSO who spoke to for the article would say things like, well, what we really need to do now is try to reach the climate-aware majority. So that is what we're trying to do in the Climate Majority project, and we think that that could be a winning strategy. And what I've tried to do here today is lay out reasons for thinking that the emphasis on strategic and transformative adaptation could be a central part of that strategy.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hello, Rupert.
Hiya.
It's Casper from Media Revolution here. Just talking about the media, the impacts that we see that the media have are constant and all around us, despite the fact that there is a large majority that arguably want to see government policy in support of net zero very quickly. That government policy isn't there. And we need that transformation, adaptive transformation that you're talking about, first and foremost, I would argue, in the media. Otherwise, throughout history, we've seen that governments do not enact policy that the public want, despite the fact there is a majority, exactly where we are now. How do you intend to deal with that media in that way? Particularly, we know who the media is. We know it's the media owners. We know particularly it's the right-wing media that is setting the narrative here. And they are also not imagining a future that the public can get hold of in an easily and understandable way.
Yeah.
That is a huge barrier that is arguably going to stop the climate-aware majority. How do you intend to deal with that?
Yeah, great question, and thank you for your important work of yourself and your colleagues over the past few years in that area, Casper. I completely agree. If we don't get somewhere with the media, then we are definitely not going to get where we need to get. It is one of the essential conditions for the arising to full self-consciousness and then power of the silent climate-aware majority. How to make that change is pretty daunting. I do have some ideas. We're working on this in the Climate Majority project. I'll mention to you all one of my bolder ideas. So you'll all be aware of the comparative success of GB News. What I mean by that is that GB News is obviously most of their programs are absolute drivel and unwatchable. And yet they've not only attracted not a significant audience, but that much more importantly, in my view, they've influenced the rest of the media landscape by doing things like, for example, getting GB News presenters and pundits onto programs on the BBC, et cetera, et cetera. What moral do I draw from this unsalubrious story? One moral I draw from it is that really one of the things we need to be doing is we need to have our own GB News. And I kind of mean that pretty literally. I mean, we need to have a channel which is like GB News, except I think it should be wider in its programming output. Like ideally it would have, for example, dramas and documentaries and stuff in it, as well as just news and current affairs. Hopefully the programs would mostly be actually good and watchable, which would be great. But the most important thing would be that it had people like some of us hosting the programs, appearing on the programs, etc. And it could then act as a kind of counterweight, and hopefully a more powerful counterweight to GB News. So how do you create something like that? Well, the most obvious way to do it is by finding someone who's got like 50, 60 million pounds hanging around. Well, those people, of course, do exist. I mean, people who are like that and who think some of the kinds of things that folk like us think. So it's a big ask, but I actually think that that is a prominent example of the kind of thing that we really need to be trying to do at this point. If we're actually serious about making these kinds of transformations, that's the kind of thing we need to be able to do. I'm also going to try to connect the question with what's been said over the last 5 or 10 minutes in the following way. I think there is an opportunity now in the dreadful historic moment that we're in of the problem, the tragedy getting worse, escalating, the politics moving in the wrong direction, just up or hanging up the high vis, et cetera, I think there is an opportunity now to kind of redefine what climate and environmental action is, and to make it more relevant to the climate majority, as we call them. I think at the heart of that, as I've been describing, is beginning with impact. I think if we were to do this, and we were to systematically sort of implement, if you will, the kind of strategy that I've been outlining this afternoon, it would be a lot harder for the media to A, polarize around it, or B, sort of ignore it, right? So you mentioned this phrase net zero, which has become very polarized. There's this whole kind of, stupid debate around man-made climate change, how bad is it, how much responsibility do we have for it, etc. Most of that debate is kind of not really relevant to the questions of adaptation and resilience, right? So like, whose fault is it, for example? Obviously a very important question, but not actually the most important question. The most important question is, what are we going to do about it? When you start by drawing people's attentions to impacts and people banding together to do something about those impacts, you're making questions of responsibility and of kind of where we're going to be in 2050, et cetera, less central, right? You're making the questions more tangible. It becomes a bit more like, responding to a pandemic or responding to an invasion from a hostile foreign power. And that's what we need to actually get things started and to actually start to depolarize the question. So I guess, there's many more things I could say in response to your splendid question, as I'm sure you could. But those are the two I would start with. On the one hand, we need to think, among other things, big, like our own TV station. And on the other hand, we need to think about how do we reposition, redefine the climate and environmental movement, what climate action is, in such a way that it is harder for the right-wing media to polarize against us and easier for people to identify with what we're talking about. And the case I've made is the way we do that is by turning the discourse onto the question of adaptation and resilience.
Right, we've got 3 questions online, 4 questions in the room, so we'll start online. So Phil from Transition New Mills is asking, can you tell us more about imagination and the role it plays in transformative adaptation, storytelling, play, visioning, and how do we embed these practices in our communities?
Yeah, crucial question. So let me mention the concept of Fruitopia, which is discussed in this book. Some of you may be aware of it, a concept I coined 8 years ago, which Amanda Scott writes about in the book. And the idea of Fruitopia is that one way of thinking about it is this, that transformative adaptation is this kind of enormous enterprise that needs to involve, well, everybody, all citizens. It has special roles in it for people like engineers, farmers, food growers, all the people who are going to be involved in, well, the kind of responsive and proactive adaptations that we're going to need to make in relation to what is coming. But there's a dimension of it which can be neglected, but mustn't be neglected, which is the imaginative dimension, right? So transformative adaptation considered at the level of imagination, of scenarios, of fiction, that is what calls for the concept of Fruitopia. And the idea of Fruitopia is traditionally when people have sought to create a better world as a response to the risk that we're heading towards a dystopia, which we are, is they've looked to the concept of utopia, like imagine a perfect world, imagine the world we want to get to. That's where we ought to be heading towards. So the claim I've made is, well, if that was ever a good idea, unfortunately, it's not a good idea anymore, because that kind of ideal world is definitively now closed to us, because we are deep into the danger zone. We are in effect never going to get out of it. The lives of everyone in this room are going to be defined more and more by the climate crisis and other aspects of the poly crisis, even if we do the best we possibly can. So what we need to do is to figure out how we get through what is coming, in the best way possible. It's got to be process-oriented, not oriented towards some kind of fantasized, static, imagined endpoint. And that's the idea of Throughtopia, how we get through what is coming in the best way possible as a shared imaginative exercise. And I think one of the most important things that needs to happen in our society right now is for everyone who is engaged with the art of imagination, and that is crucially writers of fiction and filmmakers and so forth, but it's also advertisers and marketers and philosophers and systems thinkers and so forth. For all such people to be deliberately engaged in a Throughotopian endeavor, the endeavor to imagine how transformative adaptation might be instantiated in ways that are attractive and that people can imagine themselves into. And we are just starting to get serious Throughotopian works of fiction appearing. I've argued that the end we start from, the book and film, is one such. I mentioned the Deluge, which is, in my opinion, the greatest Throughotopian work we as yet have, the climate epic by Stephen Markley, which very interestingly has in it a central role as the plot develops for a serious adaptation endeavor. And I think that's no coincidence.
Thank you. Harry's going to bring the mic over. Next question in the room, then online. We'll alternate a bit.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for an excellent talk. My name is Giuseppe. I run the Odessian Institute, which is a charity that's aiming to combine citizen assemblies with integrations from the sciences and systems thinkers through horizon scans, so panels of scientists, and also modeling of different risks, not just the climate crisis, but the poly-crisis more broadly. I wonder if you could comment on the role citizen assemblies or community assemblies might have in accelerating this kind of adaptation.
Yeah.
I think I'll give a spicy example, which I refer to from history, which is not quite the same, but during the French Revolution, I think in one afternoon, the nobles voted away their privileges as part of the revolutionary fervor that was instigated by the National Assembly. Although we're maybe not aiming for the exact same kinds of outcome, or material conditions are very different now, I was wondering if there's some specific route through an assembly that might help either the local or the national level, these kinds of adaptations to occur.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful example you gave for those not familiar with it. I'm quite a French Revolution buff because I think it gives us inspiring examples like this. It also gives us terrible cautionary tales of what can go wrong a little bit later down the line, mostly. Yeah, so in the French Revolution, you had the Estates General, which was separated between the clerics and the nobles and the commoners. And then in this inspiring moment where the king tried to shut them down, they came together, most of them. Some of the clerics and nobles refused to, but most of them came together and like, oh, we're all just going to be one body now, and we're going to figure it out together. And then out of that, you in due course, you got formed the National Assembly. And then, as you point out, the National Assembly, this astonishing thing happened at one point of the nobles revoking their own privileges. Can we expect something similar today? Yeah, I would hope so, but it feels to me like it's somehow less likely now. Why is that? Look, I think what we have to work towards is being ready to take advantage of the frankly very difficult conditions and moments that are going to be coming down the track at us. This has been a theme of a lot of my writing over the last several years, that when people seek to find the answer, the solution to the climate crisis, they're kind of looking down the wrong end of the telescope. What you actually ought to be doing is looking more deeply into the crisis, into the really bad stuff, and finding in that the way that we may get through it. So what do I mean? So for example, there is going to be an escalating wall or wave of climate disasters coming. And one response to that is to think, oh, Christ, shit, this would be terrible. Another slightly better response is think, okay, well, we need to be ready for those disasters and try to build some preparedness for them. That's obviously pointing in the right direction. But the place one really wants to get to is a place of thinking, these disasters are going to be opportunities. They're going to be opportunities to bring people together. Right? They're going to be opportunities to grow community and solidarity and a sense of what's at stake and so on and so forth. I had this discussion once with Rebecca Solnit, who some of you will be well aware of. Her best book, in my opinion, is a book called The Paradise is Built in Hell. Fantastic title, fantastic book, right? Basically what the book's about is disasters and how often they lead to better outcomes than were present before the disaster. And I put to Rebecca, when I met her some years ago, I put to her, would you agree that this same logic applies to the coming climate disasters? She was like, yeah, absolutely. So we need to be deliberately placing ourselves. It can sound a bit sort of like, oh, is you sort of ambulance chasing or something? No, I mean, we're not hoping these disasters come. They are going to come, right? So we need to be as ready for them as possible in terms of being prepared for them, and ready for them in terms of being able to take advantage of them to create things that were not possible to create before. So it could be that in the wake of some of the coming climate disasters, and more generally the enormous pressure our society is going to be subject to, and other societies in the coming decade or two, that there are opportunities to bring people together in assemblies which have not occurred before. I would recommend on this Adam Greenfield's book, Lifehouse. I don't agree with everything that Adam says in the book, and I think he's actually too pessimistic about where we're headed. He makes me seem like some kind of naive optimist sometimes. But I do agree with his emphasis on the opportunities and the necessity in the difficult climate times that are coming for constructing effective people's assemblies in local communities to decide how to share resources, how to guard ourselves against rising impact threats, etc. But I also think that's not enough. And I want to come back to the wording of your question, because you used the term citizens' assemblies. And I do think, as many of us learned from the experience of XR, I do think that citizens' assemblies, I mean, properly constituted citizens' assemblies where you don't just have like the people who turn up making the decisions, that's great. But there's also a role for citizens' assemblies where you're making sure that you've got a cross-section of the community fairly democratically represented. So citizens' assemblies can really make a claim to be democratic. I think there is, or should be, a greater role for them in future. One thing I would like to see in relation to the climate and nature bill, for example, if people try to bring that back, is a much more significant role in it for adaptation and resilience. In other words, the endeavor to bring in a climate and nature bill, which is sort of one of the kind of totems of what it would be like to have a successful climate and ecological movement in this country, if we're able to pass that bill in, say, 7 or 8 years' time. Again, people say, well, 7 or 8 years' time, we can't wait that long. Well, good luck getting it done any sooner. It's not going to happen, right? But if people started now, they might be able to get that bill through in 7 or 8 years' time by building what we call the climate majority in the meantime. If we had a climate and nature bill brought in, it should have very prominently in it a National Citizens' Assembly for resilience and adaptation, not just for mitigation and not just for nature, vital those things are. I'll say one more thing, which is the Climate Majority Project Strategic Adaptation Campaign, which is coming this summer. We call it SAFER, Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. You heard it here first. The SAFER campaign, one of our proposals in that campaign is to have what we call a people's plan for climate resilience, which could be a sort of prequel to an actual official state-sanctioned citizens' assembly on climate and nature, including adaptation and so forth. And the idea in the People's Plan for Climate Resilience would be, what if we were to create a citizens' assembly which was modeled as a proper democratic citizens' assembly, so it had all the right kind of level of demographic discrimination between the various members of the Citizens' Assembly. You made sure it was properly representative. What if you had such a Citizens' Assembly that was well resourced and actually did look at our situation and thought together, had citizens thinking together about, okay, well, yeah, how are we going to cope with what's here and what's coming? We think if that were done well, then it would be a brilliant model, and it would basically sort of dare the government either to implement its recommendations or to do their own official state-sanctioned version of it. And the nice thing about a People's Plan for Climate Resilience, it could probably be resourced with about a hundredth of what it would take to resource the TV station we talked about earlier, right? You can do something like that for just a few £100,000. Or, you know, I mean, £1 million, you'd be able to do it in some of those incredible sort of 5-star kind of way. You know, that's the kind of thing which is eminently fundable. So that's one of the things we're going to be putting forward in the SAFER campaign launch. Our SAFER report will be out this summer, so look out for that. And thank you for the question and for your good work.
All right, who's got a question? Hands up. All right, there's too many questions. I'm going to ask one online, and then we'll take a final one or two in the room. Are you happy to stick around for an extra 5 minutes? We're nearly up on time, but
no one's left yet, which is always a good sign.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so what's the role of finance, and how can we mobilize the finance sector?
Yeah. So it's all just very small questions today, all just very small, easy questions. So yeah, I mean, obviously, again, you know, we could talk for hours on that, couldn't we? I'm going to home in on one thing which is relevant to what we've been talking about here. So one of the initiatives of the Climate Majority Project is called the Future of Insurance Working Group, or to give it its full title, the Confidential Future of Insurance Working Group. Because what we've done is we've brought together a bunch of people from in and around the insurance world, and actuaries and brokers and so forth, into a setting where they can talk freely in private with each other and with us and so forth. And the idea of it is to try to get those people first to be able to talk freely, to see what comes out of that. And secondly, for this to be a springboard for, we hope, going to, well, ultimately the boards of insurance companies and talking Turkey with them. Because obviously the question of financing is so vast. There's been a lot of work done on the role of banks in the climate crisis. The role of pension funds, obviously, also enormously important. But insurance has been kind of neglected by contrast. And it's just started to spring into a little bit of prominence in the last year or two. There still hasn't really been any serious kind of political or campaigning consumer-style action around insurance. And this is kind of striking to us and problematic because there is enormous potential leverage in insurance. Why? Well, the simple way to understand it is as follows. We're heading towards an uninsurable world, right? The dystopia we're heading towards is called by insurance companies and many others, because insurance plays a vital role in a capitalist society, an uninsurable world. We're headed towards an uninsurable world. Let me point out something basic and obvious, but sometimes neglected about an uninsurable world. It has no insurance companies in it. So there is a set of the finance community which is, or at least should be, very, very deeply incentivized to actually do something about this crisis that we're in, i.e. insurance companies. To put it in quite a kind of striking way, the interests of insurance companies are fundamentally opposed to the interests of, say, fossil fuel companies, right? Insurance companies ought to be funding people like the Climate Majority Project or XR, whoever, right? Whereas fossil fuel companies, it'd be very surprising if they wanted to fund us. So the basic idea of our working group is we want to get to the insurers and make this case and say, do you want to have a future? Do you want your company to exist more than another 5 or 10 years? Then you better change the way that you're acting. And in particular, and this is the connection obviously with the topic today, it's enormously to the advantage of insurance companies that we start to become more adapted and more resilient, right? So I was talking about this with Rob earlier, and we were saying to ourselves, imagine the SAFER campaign or TRAD kind of getting somewhere in local communities in this country and actually having some success in making them more resilient and adapted, more prepared for floods, more prepared for fires, wildfires, more food resilient, et cetera, in such a world, which could be this country in 10 years' time, there would be less insurance claims, right? There would be less people getting flooded out of their homes, there would be less people forced out on their uppers, etc. So the basic idea is there is lots to do in the insurance, in the financial space. And one of the most important things is to start action in relation to insurance. Huge point of leverage with enormous potential synergy with the strategic adaptation and transformative adaptation agenda.
Sorry. Andy, it's a good question.
I've kind of answered some of it.
Oh, okay. All right. No, Eddie, it's a good question. Is it? Okay.
Hi, Rupert. My name's
Yeah.
Eddie. We have met a couple of times before,
Yes,
just through
hello.
Exeter and what have you. But yeah, I've got background in Just Stop Oil, spent some time in prison as part of the campaign. And the reason I went that far was not because of a word like Foodtopia or transitional adaptation. It was the raw fucking terror, as you've put it, of,
Yeah.
I think I'm going to starve to death. I think, you know, I can't have children because I'm worried that they will starve to death. And it can sometimes be quite gaslighting in a way to sort of come back from that into the real world and to kind of have to look at this from a more sort of, okay, how do we get from point A to point B to point C? You have to jump through all these hoops in order to feel like you're doing something meaningful day by day, hour by hour. So my question really is, particularly for the younger people in the room, and the younger people that you reach when you give these talks, is what should we be doing? Like, how should we be tailoring our education? How should we be tailoring the vocations that we commit to? And how should we be tailoring our sort of voluntary or activist commitments? And I appreciate that that's broad, but it can be really, really hard to know sometimes.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you for the crucial question, for the passion of it. So obviously, again, so much one could say. I'll just try and say a couple of things. So one is, I just did an interview today with my old university, University of East Anglia, and one of the things I said to them, which I think is really important, is that there is something really irresponsible about the way that universities are continuing to sort of posture as places which are going to give students what they need for the rest of their lives. So it's like there's something really kind of dodgy about like careers advice, for example, in the way that it's set up now. You know, are young people such as yourselves, are you going to have a career in the ordinary sense? Well, maybe, but it's absolutely not guaranteed anymore. And we ought to be equipping people with a wider sense of skills. We ought to be equipping people with skills of community building and mediation and self-defense and permacultural food growing and so on and so forth. And that ought to be much more built into universities and into schools. Now, of course, as soon as you say that, people say, oh, you're scaring the young people, etc. Well, as you've just said yourself, you know, you're already scared. And if you're not scared, then you're not paying attention, right? So we're in a really fucking terrible situation. We need to acknowledge that. Until we acknowledge that, we can never do the things which is necessary to do in response to that. Among the things which is necessary, of course, and this is part of the answer to, well, that sounds a bit scary, is we have to deliberately resource people in order to be able to handle the fear and the other very difficult emotions, the grief, etc. That is something which, so in relation to the concept of adaptation, that is what we call inner adaptation, right? Adaptation is not just a task of physical engineering, etc. changes. It's not even exhausted by the imaginative stuff we talked about earlier. It's also about how do we, as human beings, how do we socio-psychologically, psycho-spiritually, how do we cope with this kind of stuff? That needs resourcing. So that's what some of the teaching and the courses that I do on a much bigger scale. It's what's done by organizations like the Climate Psychology Alliance. It's what's done by the Climate Majority Project in our climate courage work, which is about, you know, how do we enable people to find the courage to face up to the situation and continue to act through it, etc., in a way that enables them to face the truth and handle the difficult emotions which come when you do face the truth, right? So I'm not going to try to tell you what to do. There's numerous good things that you could potentially do. But one thing I would say is something that most of us at some point need to do, and some of us need to help others do, is do this work, the work of inner adaptation, which we think in the CMP, we think is very, very important work and is part of what's at stake in this book. And that when you are resourced in one way or another to be able to face and process where we are and what's coming, that of course places you in a better position to do whatever it is, the work that you need to do, the work that you're called to do. For a lot of people, that work will be the work of adaptation, right? That's a kind of default setting now, right? That if a citizen is asking themselves, well, I don't know what my special contribution is to the climate crisis. Well, if you live somewhere, if you know other people, if you have any practical skills, then you can get involved in the work of adaptation. And that is work that has the benefits I described of waking people up, et cetera, et cetera. It's in that way really important work. But for some people, it'll be different, right? For some people, it'll be teaching or creating through utopian art, or it'll be doing the inner adaptation stuff, which is, in a certain sense, a little bit more specialized. So yeah, I hope that's a kind of answer to your very important question. We could talk about it more. I don't want to tell you what to do, but I can say to you, there are some points which are stronger points of leverage than others. There are some strategies which are more likely to be effective than others. There are some things which a few of us need to do. There are some things which a lot of us need to do.
Wow. Okay. We're already past time, and I realize we need time for those of you who are going to go and fight for his pile of books there. So we're going to wrap it up here, but I just want to thank you all for your questions and for being here and for being so engaged. This is the beginning. Again, there's a couple of weeks. Come to our session where we're gonna, it's gonna be assembly style. We're gonna figure out a plan to incorporate transformative adaptation into our lives here and now in Exeter. And also, if you're interested in assemblies, you're curious, we're holding community assemblies every month in St. David's. You don't have to live in St. David's. If you're curious, come and grab a leaflet. And I guess let's just thank Rupert for joining us tonight.